Robert Coleman never thought much about flat tires. Why would he? For the past 20 years, his personal driver handled all the car troubles, while Robert sat in the back seat, making deals over the phone or reviewing contracts on his tablet. But today was different. Today, his driver called in sick and Robert decided to drive himself to the monthly board meeting at the Riverside Country Club. The black Mercedes purred down the highway like a satisfied cat. Robert adjusted his Italian silk tie and glanced at his Rolex. He had plenty of time to spare. The quarterly numbers looked good, better than good actually. His tech company had just landed another multi-million-dollar contract, and the board would be pleased. Life was smooth, predictable, and profitable. That's when he heard the sound. It started as a soft hissing, like air slowly leaking from a balloon. Robert frowned and turned down the classical music. The hissing grew louder, accompanied by a rhythmic thumping that made the steering wheel vibrate in his hands. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, hoping to make it to the country club, but the car began to pull to the right. Not today, he muttered, checking his phone for the time. The board meeting started in 40 minutes and he still had 15 miles to go. Steam began rising from under the hood, creating a white cloud that drifted across the windshield. The temperature gauge needle swung into the red zone, and warning lights lit up the dashboard like a Christmas tree. Robert had no choice but to pull over. He guided the limping Mercedes to the curb of a quiet residential street and turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt strange after years of constant motion and noise. Robert sat for a moment, staring at the steam rising from his car like smoke signals announcing his predicament to the world. The neighborhood around him was nothing like his gated community in the hills. These were small houses with front porches and gardens where children's toys lay scattered on the grass. American flags hung from some of the porches, and older cars sat in driveways beside basketball hoops and bicycles. It was the kind of place Robert drove past on his way to somewhere more important, the kind of place that existed in his peripheral vision, but never commanded his attention. He stepped out of the car, careful not to let his $1,000 shoes touch any puddles. The heat hit him immediately. Without the car's air conditioning, he realized just how hot the afternoon had become. His tailored suit, perfect for climate-controlled boardrooms, felt heavy and uncomfortable under the blazing sun. Robert walked around to the front of his car and popped the hood. Steam billowed out and he stepped back quickly, waving his hand to clear the air. He knew absolutely nothing about engines. The maze of belts, hoses, and metal parts under the hood might as well have been hieroglyphics. His phone showed 2 bars of signal, enough to make a call. He dialed his driver's number, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried his assistant next. "Jennifer, it's Robert. My car broke down, and I need you to send someone to pick me up immediately. I'm on—" He paused, realizing he had no idea what street he was on. He looked around for a street sign and spotted one at the corner. "I'm on Maple Street, about 15 miles south of the country club. How quickly can someone get here?" Jennifer's voice crackled through the phone. "Mr. Coleman, all our usual drivers are booked with other clients today. The earliest I can get someone to you is about 2 hours. 2 hours? The board meeting starts in 35 minutes. I'm sorry, sir. I can try calling a taxi or rideshare service." Robert ended the call and immediately opened his rideshare app. No drivers available in the area. He tried another app with the same result. The country club was too far to walk, especially in this heat and in his business shoes. For the first time in decades, Robert Coleman was stuck. He loosened his tie and leaned against his car, feeling sweat begin to form on his forehead. A lawnmower hummed somewhere nearby, and he could hear children playing in a backyard behind one of the houses. The sounds were so ordinary, so everyday, that they seemed almost foreign to him. A screen door slammed shut across the street, and Robert looked up to see an elderly woman watering her flowers. She glanced in his direction, and he raised his hand in a half-wave, hoping she might offer help. But she simply nodded and went back to her gardening. Robert pulled out his phone again and called the country club. "Riverside Country Club, how may I help you?" "This is Robert Coleman. I'm supposed to be at the board meeting in 30 minutes, but my car broke down. Can you tell the other board members I'll be late?" "Of course, Mr. Coleman. I'll let them know right away." He hung up and stared at his disabled car. The steam had stopped rising from the engine, but he could see fluid dripping onto the asphalt beneath it. Whatever was wrong was clearly serious, enough that he wouldn't be driving anywhere soon. The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet street, and Robert began to feel truly uncomfortable for the first time in years. Not the mild discomfort of a delayed flight or a cold meal, but the genuine helplessness that comes from being completely out of your element, with no easy solution in sight. He tried to remember the last time something like this had happened to him, the last time he'd been stranded anywhere, dependent on the kindness of strangers or his own resourcefulness. He couldn't remember such a time. His wealth had always provided a buffer against inconvenience, a wall between him and the small disasters that ordinary people faced every day. But not today. Today, Robert Coleman stood beside his expensive car on an unfamiliar street, sweating in his designer suit, with no idea what to do next. The board meeting would start without him. The contracts would wait. The deals would be delayed. For the first time in 20 years, the world would have to turn without Robert Coleman pulling the strings, and he discovered something that surprised him more than the breakdown itself. He had no idea how to ask for help. The sound of bicycle wheels on pavement caught his attention, and he looked up to see two young boys riding toward him, their bikes gleaming in the afternoon sun. They slowed as they approached, curious about the expensive car and the man in the expensive suit who clearly didn't belong in their neighborhood. Robert straightened his tie and prepared to wave them away, but something in their faces made him pause. Instead of the wariness or calculation he expected to see, he saw something he hadn't encountered in years: simple human concern. The two boys stopped their bikes about 10 feet away from Robert. The older one looked maybe 14, tall for his age with a serious expression that made him seem older than his years. The younger boy couldn't have been more than 12, but his eyes sparkled with curiosity as he stared at the sleek Mercedes and the well-dressed man standing beside it. Robert felt his hand move instinctively toward his wallet. In his world, when young people approached him, they usually wanted something: money for a school fundraiser, a donation to some cause, or sometimes just the hope that a rich man might hand out cash. He'd learned to keep a few $20 bills, ready for such moments. "Your car broke down, mister?" the older boy asked, setting one foot on the ground while keeping the other on his bike pedal. "Yes, it appears so," Robert replied, his voice carrying the formal tone he used with service workers and strangers. "But I've already called for help. Thank you for your concern." The younger boy tilted his head, studying the steam that still rose faintly from under the hood. "Looks like your radiator overheated, and you got a flat tire too." Robert blinked in surprise. He'd been so focused on the steam and warning lights that he hadn't even noticed the flat rear tire. He walked around to look, and sure enough, the right rear tire was completely flat, the rim nearly touching the asphalt. "How did you know that?" Robert asked. The boy shrugged. "My dad taught us about cars before he got deployed. You can tell by the way the car's sitting." "Deployed?" "Army," the older boy explained. "He's been overseas for 8 months now." There was a moment of awkward silence. Robert didn't know many military families. In his circle, people talked about their children attending private schools and summer camps in Europe, not parents serving in distant countries. "Well," Robert said, pulling out his phone to check the time again, "someone should be here to pick me up eventually." "Eventually might be a long time," the younger boy said, looking at the expensive car with obvious admiration. "This is a really nice car, but it's not going anywhere until you fix that radiator and change that tire." The older boy glanced at his younger brother, then back at Robert. "We could help you if you want." Robert almost laughed. Help him? These were children. What could they possibly do that he couldn't figure out himself? But then again, they'd spotted the flat tire immediately while he'd completely missed it. "That's very kind of you," he said carefully, "but I'm sure your parents wouldn't want you bothering with a stranger's car problems." "We're not bothering anybody," the younger boy said with a grin. "Mom's at work and we were just riding around anyway. Besides, Dad always said we should help people when they need it." The older boy nodded. "Do you have a spare tire?" Robert stared at him. I assume so. I mean, cars come with spare tires, don't they?" The brothers exchanged a look that Robert couldn't quite interpret. The older boy walked over to the Mercedes and ran his hand along the trunk. "Pop the trunk and let's see what you got," he said. Robert hesitated. His instincts told him to politely decline and wait for professional help. These boys seemed nice enough, but what did they really know about fixing cars? And what would people think if they drove by and saw him accepting help from neighborhood kids? But the heat was getting worse, his shirt was sticking to his back, and the board meeting had already started without him. What did he have to lose? He pressed the button on his key fob, and the trunk opened with a soft click. The boys immediately went to work, moving aside Robert's briefcase and gym bag to reveal the spare tire compartment. The younger boy whistled appreciatively. "Man, this car has everything. Look at this jack set." Robert watched in amazement as they efficiently located all the tools needed to change a tire. Tools he didn't even know were in his own car. The older boy tested the spare tire's air pressure by pressing on it with his thumb. "This should work fine," he announced. "What about the radiator?" "The what?" "The cooling system," the younger boy explained patiently, as if Robert were the child. "That's why all the steam was coming out. Your car got too hot." "My house is just down the street," the older boy said. "I can get some coolant from our garage. Dad keeps extra supplies for emergencies." Before Robert could respond, the boy was already on his bike, pedaling quickly down the street. The younger boy began setting up the jack with practiced movements that showed he'd done this before. "You really don't have to do this," Robert said, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "I can wait for a professional." The boy looked up at him with a confused expression. "Why would you wait when we can fix it right now?" "This isn't hard, but aren't you worried about getting dirty or hurt?" The boy laughed. "Mister, we work on bikes and go-karts all the time. This is just a bigger version of the same thing." Robert watched as the young boy positioned the jack with confidence and began raising the car. Everything the child did looked effortless, natural. Robert realized he'd never changed a tire in his life. He'd never even watched someone change a tire. "Where did you learn to do all this?" he asked. "Dad started teaching us when I was about 8, the boy replied, spinning the lug wrench with practiced ease. He said every man should know how to take care of his car, fix things around the house, that kind of stuff. "And your mother doesn't mind you helping strangers?" The boy paused in his work and looked up at Robert with serious eyes. "Mom always says that helping people is what makes you rich, even if you don't have much money." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. Here was a child, working in the heat to help a complete stranger, talking about richness in a way Robert had never heard before. The older boy returned, slightly out of breath, carrying a plastic container of coolant. "Got it," he announced. "But we need to wait for the engine to cool down more before we add this, or we could crack something." Robert found himself genuinely impressed by their knowledge and organization. "How long do we wait?" "Maybe 20 more minutes," the older boy said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "The tire will be done way before that." As if to prove his point, his younger brother was already removing the flat tire, working with the same steady competence his brother had shown. Robert stood there feeling useless, watching two children solve problems he couldn't even identify. "What are your names?" he asked suddenly. The boys looked at each other and grinned. "I'm Tony," said the older one. "And I'm Rico," added the younger boy, never pausing in his work. "I'm Robert," he said, and somehow saying his first name instead of Mr. Coleman felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. "Nice to meet you, Robert," Tony said with a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. "Don't worry, we'll have you back on the road in no time." 20 minutes later, Rico had finished changing the tire with the efficiency of a professional mechanic. Robert watched in fascination as the boy tightened each lug nut in a specific pattern, explaining that it helped the wheel sit evenly. "Dad showed us this crisscross pattern," Rico said, his small hands working the wrench with surprising strength. "You never tighten them all the way in order, or the wheel can warp." Robert nodded, as if he understood, though he'd never given a moment's thought to how wheels were attached to cars. In his world, such details were handled by other people, Tony tested the engine temperature by carefully touching the radiator cap with the back of his hand. Still pretty hot, but we can add coolant now if we're careful. He opened the plastic container and began pouring the bright green liquid into the radiator, while Rico lowered the jack and gathered the tools. Robert found himself studying the boys' movements, struck by how they worked together without needing to discuss who would do what. "There," Tony announced, closing the hood with a satisfying thunk. "That should get you where you need to go. But you'll want to take it to a mechanic soon. That radiator leak isn't going to fix itself." Robert stared at his car, which looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, except now it was functional again. "I can't believe you boys did all that." "It wasn't that hard," Rico said, loading the flat tire and tools back into the trunk. "Just basic stuff." Basic stuff. Robert almost smiled at the phrase. Nothing about the last hour had felt basic to him. He pulled out his wallet and extracted several bills. "Please, let me pay you for your help. This was incredibly generous of you." Both boys stepped back immediately, their expressions changing from friendly to something Robert couldn't quite read. "We don't want money," Tony said quietly. "But you saved me hours of waiting in this heat. You should be compensated for your time and effort." Rico shook his head firmly. "Our dad says you don't take money for helping people. That's not why you help." Robert felt something shift inside his chest, an uncomfortable recognition that he'd somehow insulted these children with his offer. In his world, every service had a price. Every favor created a debt. The idea that someone would refuse payment for genuine help was so foreign to him that he didn't know how to respond. "Then how can I thank you?" The boys exchanged one of their wordless looks again. "You could come meet our mom," Rico said suddenly. "She gets home from work in about an hour, and she always asks us what we did during the day. She'd probably like to know we helped someone." Tony nodded enthusiastically. "And our little sister Luna draws pictures of everyone she meets. She'd probably want to draw you, too." Robert checked his watch. The board meeting would be over by now. His assistant would have rescheduled his other appointments. For the first time in years, his calendar was completely empty. "I wouldn't want to impose on your family." "You wouldn't be imposing," Tony said. "Mom likes meeting new people, and she makes really good iced tea." Something about the simple invitation touched Robert in a way he hadn't expected. When was the last time someone had invited him somewhere just to be friendly? His social calendar was filled with business dinners, charity galas, and networking events, but genuine hospitality from strangers was completely outside his experience. "I suppose I could stay for a few minutes," he heard himself saying. The boys grinned and climbed back on their bikes. "Follow us," Rico called over his shoulder. "We're just 3 houses down." Robert started his car, relieved when the engine turned over smoothly. The temperature gauge showed normal readings, and no warning. Lights appeared on the dashboard. As he drove slowly behind the 2 bikes, he noticed details about the neighborhood that had escaped him earlier. The houses were small but well-maintained. Gardens showed signs of careful attention, even if they weren't professionally landscaped. American flags hung from several porches and children's artwork was taped to windows. It was a neighborhood where people took pride in their homes, even if those homes weren't mansions. The boys turned into the driveway of a pale yellow house with white trim. A small garden lined the front walkway, filled with vegetables and flowers, growing side by side. A tire swing hung from an old oak tree in the front yard, and chalk drawings covered sections of the driveway. Robert parked on the street and followed Tony and Rico to the front porch. The screen door was decorated with a handmade welcome sign, and wind chimes made soft music in the afternoon breeze. "Mom won't be home for about an hour," Tony said, pulling a key from his pocket. "But Luna's probably watching TV." They entered a living room that was small but comfortable. The furniture looked well used but clean, and every surface seemed to hold family photos, school projects, or small decorations that spoke of a family that spent time together. Robert noticed immediately that there was no expensive artwork, no designer accessories, none of the status symbols that filled his own home. But there was something else. Something he couldn't quite name. The house felt alive in a way his mansion never did. "Luna," Rico called. "Come meet our new friend." A girl who looked about 8 years old appeared from the kitchen, her curly hair pulled back in colorful hair ties. She studied Robert with the frank curiosity that only children possess. "Are you the man with the broken car?" she asked. "I am," Robert replied, charmed despite himself. "Your brothers fixed it for me." Luna nodded as if this was perfectly normal. "They're really good at fixing things. Tony fixed my bike last week and Rico helped me build a birdhouse for school." She disappeared for a moment and returned with a thick sketch pad and a box of crayons. "I'm going to draw you," she announced, settling cross-legged on the floor. "What's your favorite color?" Robert realized he hadn't been asked that question in decades. "Blue, I suppose." "Good choice," Luna said seriously, selecting a blue crayon. "Blue is a happy color." Tony and Rico settled on the couch, turning on a small television that showed a baseball game. Robert found himself sitting in an armchair that had probably seen 20 years of use but was surprisingly comfortable. "Do you have kids?" Luna asked, sketching with intense concentration. "No, I don't." "How come?" Robert paused, unsure how to explain his life choices to an 8-year-old. "I've been very busy with work." "What kind of work do you do?" "I run a company that makes computer programs." Luna looked up from her drawing. "That sounds important." "I suppose it is. But not as important as fixing cars when people need help," she said matter-of-factly, returning to her artwork. Robert sat in the small living room watching Luna draw, listening to the boys cheer for their baseball team, and feeling something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like he belonged somewhere. The sound of a car, door slamming outside made all 3 children look toward the window. Luna jumped up from her drawing and ran to peek through the curtains. "Mom's home," she announced, and Robert felt his stomach tighten with unexpected nervousness. The front door opened, and a woman in blue hospital scrubs entered, looking tired but smiling when she saw her children. She was probably in her early 30s, with the same warm eyes as her kids and an air of quiet strength that Robert recognized immediately. "Hey, babies," she said, setting down a small purse and kicking off her white nursing shoes. "How was your afternoon?" "Mom, this is Robert," Tony said, gesturing toward the well-dressed man sitting somewhat awkwardly in their living room. "His car broke down on Maple Street and we helped him fix it." The woman's expression shifted instantly from tired contentment to concerned alertness. Her gaze moved from Robert to her children and back again, and Robert could practically see her, calculating whether her kids had done something dangerous. "They were wonderful," Robert said quickly, standing up. "I'm sorry to intrude in your home like this. Your boys insisted I wait to meet you, and your daughter wanted to draw my picture." He gestured toward Luna, who held up her artwork proudly. The drawing showed a tall figure in a blue suit standing next to a black car, with 2 smaller figures holding what looked like tools. Despite the crayon medium and 8-year-old artistic skills, it somehow captured the essence of the afternoon perfectly. The woman's posture relaxed slightly, but Robert could see she was still processing the unusual situation. "I'm Patricia," she said, extending her hand. "And you are?" "Robert Coleman." He shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the small calluses that spoke of someone who worked with her hands. "Your children are remarkable. I've never seen kids their age handle a car repair with such skill and confidence." Patricia's expression softened into pride. Their father taught them well before his deployment. He always said they needed to know how to take care of themselves and help others. "Tony mentioned he's overseas." 15 months now," Patricia said, and Robert caught a flicker of worry in her eyes before she masked it with a smile. "But we're managing just fine." She looked around the living room, and Robert suddenly saw it through her eyes. Her children, entertaining a stranger, a man in an expensive suit who clearly came from a different world than theirs. He realized how odd this situation must seem to her. "Would you like some iced tea?" Patricia asked, her natural hospitality overriding her caution. "It's been a hot day." "That would be very kind, thank you." Patricia disappeared into the kitchen, and Robert could hear the sounds of ice clinking into glasses. Luna returned to her drawing, adding what appeared to be a sun in the corner of the paper. The boys resumed watching their baseball game, but Robert noticed they kept glancing toward the kitchen. "Is everything all right?" he asked Tony quietly. Mom works really hard, Tony replied, lowering his voice. She was at the hospital for 12 hours today. She always comes home tired, but she never complains. What does she do there? She's a nurse, Rico said with obvious pride. She takes care of people who are really sick. Sometimes she has to work double shifts when they're short-staffed. Patricia returned with a tray holding 4 glasses of iced tea garnished with lemon slices. She'd changed out of her scrubs into a simple sundress, and Robert noticed she'd taken a moment to brush her hair and put on a bit of lipstick. So, Mr. Coleman, she said, settling into the chair across from him, what kind of work brings you to our neighborhood? Please call me Robert. I was driving to a business meeting when my car overheated. I run a technology company downtown, and you said the boys helped fix your car. Robert nodded, still amazed by the memory. They diagnosed both problems immediately and had everything running perfectly in less than an hour. I was completely helpless, but they handled it like professional mechanics. Patricia smiled, but Robert detected something else in her expression, a kind of resigned sadness that he couldn't quite understand. They're good boys, she said simply. More than good, Robert insisted. They're exceptional. Tony knew exactly how to check engine temperature and add coolant safely. Rico changed my tire faster than most service stations could have done it, and they refused to accept any payment. We don't take money for helping people, Luna chimed in from the floor, not looking up from her drawing. That's not what helping is for. Patricia nodded approvingly at her daughter, but Robert saw her glance toward a stack of bills on a small desk in the corner of the room. Your children mentioned they're excellent students as well, Robert continued. Straight A's, Patricia confirmed, though her pride was mixed with something that looked like worry. Tony wants to study engineering in college. He's always building things, taking apart electronics to see how they work. And Rico? Rico dreams of medical school. He reads my nursing textbooks and asks questions that surprise my colleagues. Robert felt something tighten in his chest. Those are ambitious goals. Yes, they are. Patricia's voice carried a weight that spoke of dreams that seemed impossible and bills that kept growing. What about Luna? What does she want to be when she grows up? An artist, Luna announced without hesitation. I want to draw pictures that make people happy. She's already doing that, Robert said, smiling at the little girl. Patricia stood up to collect the empty glasses, and Robert noticed her wince slightly as she bent over. The long shift at the hospital had clearly taken its toll. Can I help with anything? He offered. Oh no, you're our guest. But Tony and Rico were already up, clearing the remaining glasses and straightening the cushions. Robert watched them work together, each child knowing exactly what needed to be done without being asked. They help me a lot, Patricia said, noticing Robert's observation. Sometimes I think they're more responsible than most adults I know. As the evening light began to fade through the windows, Robert realized he'd been in this small house for over 2 hours. It was longer than he'd spent in any non-business social situation in years, and he felt more relaxed than he had in months. I should probably let you folks get on with your evening, he said reluctantly. You're welcome to stay for dinner, Patricia offered. It's nothing fancy, just spaghetti and salad, but there's plenty. Robert looked around the room at this family who had shown him more genuine kindness in one afternoon than he'd experienced in years. He thought about his empty mansion, his solitary dinner that would be prepared by his housekeeper and eaten alone while he reviewed business reports. If you're sure it's not too much trouble, he heard himself saying. No trouble at all, Patricia smiled. Luna, will you show Robert your other drawings while I start dinner? As Luna eagerly pulled out more artwork to share, Robert realized something that should have terrified him but somehow didn't. He didn't whoa. And this afternoon to end. 6 months later, Robert sat at the same kitchen table where he'd shared his first dinner with Patricia and her children. But everything had changed since that evening, when a flat tire had brought him into their lives. The kitchen itself looked different now. The old refrigerator had been replaced with a newer model that didn't hum quite so loudly. Fresh paint brightened the walls, and new curtains hung at the windows. But these changes hadn't come from Robert, throwing money at problems. They'd come from something much more meaningful, Are you nervous about tomorrow? Patricia asked, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. Robert smiled, watching Luna color at the other end of the table. A little. It's been a long time since I've spoken at a high school graduation. You'll do fine, Tony called from the living room where he was packing for his trip to MIT. The full scholarship he'd received wasn't just because of his grades, though those had always been excellent. It was because of the robotics program that had been quietly established at the local high school, complete with equipment and mentorship opportunities that had allowed students like Tony to showcase their true potential. Robert had never put his name on any of the donations. He'd learned that true generosity didn't require recognition. I still can't believe Tony's really leaving for college, Rico said, emerging from the bathroom with damp hair. He'd grown taller over the past 6 months, and his voice was starting to crack in that awkward way of teenage boys. The house is going to be so quiet. You'll be fine, Luna said matter-of-factly, not looking up from her coloring. Besides, you'll be busy with your own stuff. She was right. Rico had been accepted into a special summer program at the local community college, taking advanced science courses that would put him ahead when he started high school in the fall. The program was free for students who qualified, thanks to an anonymous benefactor who believed that talent shouldn't be limited by zip code. Patricia sat down beside Robert, and he noticed she looked more rested than she had 6 months ago. Telioibao. Second job she'd been working at a clinic across town was no longer necessary, not because Robert had simply handed her money, but because he'd helped her apply for a better position at the Children's Hospital downtown. A position that paid better, and actually used her specialized training in pediatric care. I never thanked you properly, she said quietly so the children couldn't hear. For what? You know for what? Robert shook his head. I should be thanking you, all of you. You saved more than my car that day. It was true. The flat tire had been the least of what was broken in Robert's life. He'd been living in a mansion that felt like a museum, surrounded by expensive things but empty of any real meaning. His days had been filled with meetings and deals that made him richer, but left him feeling poorer in every way that mattered. Now he lived in a smaller house just 4 blocks away from Patricia and the kids. He'd sold the mansion and most of its contents, keeping only what actually meant something to him, which it turned out wasn't very much. His new house had a front porch where he sat in the evenings, a garden where he was learning to grow vegetables with Luna's help, and a garage where he and Rico worked on an old motorcycle they were restoring together. It was the first home he'd had in decades, rather than just a place where he stored his possessions. Remember when you tried to pay us for fixing your car? Rico laughed, joining them at the table with a bowl of cereal. I was so confused when you refused, Robert admitted. I didn't understand why anyone would help without expecting something in return. And now look at you, Patricia said with a smile, teaching financial literacy classes at the community center, mentoring young entrepreneurs, serving on the school board. Robert had discovered that having money was far less satisfying than using it to create opportunities for others. His company had always been successful, but now it had purpose beyond profit. They'd opened a new division focused on providing technology training in underserved communities, creating jobs while teaching valuable skills. The front door opened, and Robert heard familiar footsteps. Dad! Luna shrieked, abandoning her coloring to run toward the living room. Robert's chest tightened with emotion as he watched the reunion. Sergeant David Martinez had been home for 2 weeks now, his deployment finally over. The man was everything Robert had imagined from the children's stories, strong and gentle, with eyes that sparkled when he looked at his family. David appeared in the kitchen doorway with Luna in his arms and his sons close behind. He'd been surprised at first to find that his family had acquired an unofficial uncle during his absence. But any concerns had vanished when he saw how his children had thrived, not just academically but emotionally. Morning, Robert, David said, settling Luna in her chair and ruffling Rico's hair. You ready for your big speech tomorrow? As ready as I'll ever be. David poured himself coffee and sat down at the table. The kitchen, which had felt spacious with just Patricia and the kids, now felt perfectly full with everyone gathered around the old wooden table. What are you going to tell them? Tony asked, taking a break from his packing. Robert had been thinking about that question for weeks. What do you say to a group of teenagers who are about to go out into the world? What wisdom could he offer? From his own journey? I think I'll tell them about the day my car broke down, he said finally. The family exchanged knowing smiles. I'll tell them that sometimes the things that seem like disasters are actually the best things that can happen to you. That helping others isn't just about making them feel good, it makes you feel good too. And that the richest people aren't the ones with the most money, but the ones with the best relationships. Are you going to tell them about how you couldn't change a tire? Rico asked with a grin. Definitely. And how 2 kids taught a grown man more about life in one afternoon than he'd learned in 20 years of business school. Luna looked up from her drawing, which showed a group of people sitting around a table that looked remarkably like the one they were gathered around now. Are you going to tell them that family isn't just the people you're born with? She asked. Sometimes it's the people who choose to love you. Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. This 8-year-old girl had summed up everything he'd learned in the month since his car had broken down on Maple Street. Yes, he said, his voice slightly rough. I think that might be the most important thing of all. As the morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, Robert looked around the table at the people who had become his family. Tomorrow he would stand in front of hundreds of graduates and try to explain how a flat tire had changed his life. But right now, sitting in this warm kitchen surrounded by love and laughter, he knew that some things were too wonderful for words. Sometimes the best stories didn't need to be told. They just needed to be lived.